My name is Ryan Cooper, and I run a small off-road repair and customization shop in Henderson, Nevada. It's not some big corporate operation with glass offices and managers in suits. It's a dusty building on the edge of town with 3 garage bays, a welding station, and more lifted trucks and side-by-sides than most people would expect to see in one place. The kind of shop where the smell of oil never really leaves your clothes. I built that place from nothing. 10 years ago it was just me, a borrowed set of tools, and an old lift that barely worked. I spent years grinding through 12-hour days, fixing suspensions, installing lift kits, and fabricating custom parts for people who loved tearing through the Nevada desert on weekends. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. And for a long time, Megan and I ran it together. My wife handled the business side of things, paperwork, supplier negotiations, invoices, the stuff that made my head spin. I handled the machines, the builds, the mechanical side. We used to joke that together we made one complete brain. At least, that's what I believed for most of our marriage. Looking back now, the first crack appeared on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Started like any other workday. The shop had been busy all week, which wasn't unusual during riding season. A group of guys had dropped off their trucks for suspension upgrades before a big desert run, and we were trying to finish everything before the weekend. Around 4 in the afternoon, one of our hydraulic lifts started making a horrible grinding noise. 5 minutes later, it stopped working entirely. Without the lift, we couldn't safely finish the jobs we had scheduled for the evening. So I had no choice but to shut things down early. My mechanics were more than happy to clock out ahead of time, and I figured I might as well take advantage of the rare free evening. Normally, I didn't get home until after 8. That day, I walked through my front door just after 6. The house was quiet. No TV, no music, no sound of Megan moving around upstairs. She wasn't home yet. I kicked off my boots near the door and tossed my keys on the kitchen counter. For the first time in weeks, I actually had time to relax. I opened the fridge and stared inside, trying to decide if I wanted to cook something or maybe order takeout. That's when something caught my eye. A receipt was lying on the kitchen table. At first, I barely noticed it. Receipts end up everywhere in our house. Pockets, countertops, the floor of Megan's car. Usually they're crumpled or folded. But this one looked different. It was laid perfectly flat in the center of the table, almost like someone had just taken it out of their wallet. I picked it up without thinking. The restaurant name was printed across the top, and it immediately stood out. It was one of those upscale places on the Las Vegas Strip, dim lighting, expensive wine lists, the kind of restaurant people go to for anniversaries or corporate dinners. Not the kind of place Megan and I ever visited unless it was a very special occasion. I scanned the receipt slowly. 2 entrees, wine, dessert. The total was just under $300. I frowned. Megan and I had been careful with money ever since opening the shop. Spending that kind of cash on dinner wasn't something we usually did without talking about it first. Then I noticed the line that made my stomach tighten. Dinner for 2. I checked the date. Today. Then the time. A little after 5. About an hour earlier. For a moment, I just stood there staring at the paper in my hand. Earlier that day, Megan had told me she had a meeting with suppliers. Something about negotiating prices for suspension components and tires. It had sounded normal, routine even, but supplier meetings usually happened over phone calls, or maybe coffee, not at luxury restaurants. I told myself there was probably a reasonable explanation. Maybe several suppliers had come into town. Maybe it was a formal business dinner. Maybe I was overthinking something that didn't matter. Still, I didn't put the receipt down. I was holding it when Megan walked through the front door about 20 minutes later. She looked surprised when she saw me. "Ryan," she said, "you're home early." Her tone was casual, almost cheerful. I lifted the receipt slightly. "What's this?" She glanced at it. Just a quick look. And then she shrugged. "Oh," she said. "That was dinner with an investor." The answer came so easily it almost sounded rehearsed. "Investor?" I repeated. "Yeah," she said, setting her purse on the counter and slipping off her heels. "A guy who might help expand the shop." I waited for more explanation. None came. She walked over to the sink, poured herself a glass of water, and took a slow sip like this was a completely ordinary conversation. "So," I said carefully, "why didn't you tell me about it?" She sighed immediately. Not the guilty kind of sigh, the annoyed kind. "Ryan," she said, leaning against the counter, "you really need to stop assuming the worst about everything." I blinked. "What are you talking about?" "You're acting like I did something wrong," she said. "This was a business meeting." "With wine and dessert?" I asked. Her expression hardened slightly. "That's how deals get made sometimes," she said. "Not everything happens in a garage with grease on the floor." The comment stung more than I expected. Before I could respond, she continued. "This guy manages investments for small businesses. He might be able to help us open a second location someday." I folded my arms. "Okay. But you could have mentioned it." She shook her head. "I didn't think it was a big deal." Then she looked directly at me. "Unless you don't trust me." Suddenly the conversation shifted. It stopped being about the receipt. Instead it turned into a lecture about how I was too suspicious. How I didn't understand modern business relationships. How successful people often met over dinner and drinks. By the time the conversation ended, I actually felt like the unreasonable one. So I dropped it. I told myself I was overthinking things. But later that night, lying awake in bed while Megan slept beside me, I couldn't stop thinking about that receipt. Because deep down, something didn't feel right. And even though I didn't realize it yet, that small piece of paper was the first sign that my life was about to fall apart. For the next few days after the restaurant receipt incident, I tried to convince myself that nothing was wrong. That's what most people do, I think. When something uncomfortable appears in your life, your first instinct isn't to investigate it. It's to explain it away. I told myself Megan was right. Maybe business dinners really did happen like that. Maybe I was just being paranoid after working too many long days at the shop. Maybe the stress was getting to me, so I let it go. At least on the surface. But something strange happens once a seed of doubt is planted in your mind. Even if you try to ignore it, it quietly starts connecting dots you never noticed before. Little things that once felt normal suddenly start looking different. About a week after the receipt incident, I was closing up the shop late at night when one of my mechanics asked a simple question. "Hey Ryan," he said while wiping grease off his hands. "Did your wife ever finalize that new parts supplier?" I looked up from the toolbox. "What do you mean?" "The one she said she was negotiating with," he replied. "The company from California." I frowned. Megan had mentioned meeting suppliers that night at the restaurant, but she hadn't said anything about a specific company. And as far as I knew, nothing new had been finalized. "Not yet," I said slowly. My mechanic shrugged. "Oh. She was talking about it last week when she stopped by the shop." That conversation stayed in my head all the way home, because Megan hadn't mentioned any new supplier deals since that dinner. At the time, I pushed the thought aside again. But then more small things started piling up. Over the next few weeks, Megan began staying out later and later. At first, it was just an extra hour after work. Then there were nights when she didn't come home until almost midnight. Whenever I asked about it, the answer was always the same. Business meetings. Sometimes it was suppliers. Sometimes investors. Sometimes networking events, she said, were important for expanding the shop. The explanations sounded reasonable enough. But her behavior around the house had started to change too. Megan had never cared much about clothes before. Most of the time she dressed casually, jeans, simple tops, comfortable shoes. But suddenly she started buying expensive outfits. Designer dresses. New heels. Even jewelry I'd never seen before. The first time I noticed it, she was standing in front of the bedroom mirror adjusting a black dress that looked like it belonged at some fancy event downtown. "Since when do you own something like that?" I asked. She smiled casually. "Business image," she said. "If we want investors to take us seriously, I can't show up looking like I just walked out of the garage." The explanation made sense. Still, something about it felt off. Another change was her phone. Before all of this started, Megan had never been protective of it. If it buzzed on the table, Either one of us might glance at it or hand it to the other person. But now her phone was always in her hand. Always. If she left the room, the phone went with her. If a message notification popped up while we were sitting together, she would immediately flip the screen over. One night, I walked into the living room while she was texting someone. The moment she noticed me, she locked the screen instantly. It was so fast it almost looked like a reflex. "Who was that?" I asked casually. "Work," she said without hesitation. Then she changed the subject. At first I told myself again that I was imagining things. But then a name started appearing more often in our conversations. Daniel Harris. The first time Megan mentioned him, it was during dinner. "Oh," she said casually while scrolling through her phone. "Daniel thinks we might be able to attract a larger investment group if we restructure the financial plan." I looked up. "Daniel?" She nodded. "Daniel Harris. He's a financial consultant." "What does he do?" "He helps small businesses find investors," she explained. "Basically, he connects companies like ours with people willing to fund expansion." It sounded useful. Actually, it sounded like exactly the kind of person who could help a small shop like mine grow. So I didn't question it. Over the next month, his name kept coming up. "Daniel thinks we should look at a second location. Daniel says investors prefer seeing structured growth plans. Daniel wants to review our numbers next week." Every time she talked about him, it sounded completely professional, like a normal business relationship. But eventually I noticed something strange. For someone who was supposedly helping our business so much, I had never actually met him. I mentioned that one night while Megan was getting ready to go out again. "Maybe I should sit down with this Daniel guy sometime," I said. "If he's helping with the shop, I'd like to hear his ideas." She paused for a second while putting on her earrings. Then she shrugged. "Maybe later," she said. "Why not now?" "He's really busy," she replied quickly. "And most of what he's doing right now is financial planning stuff. It would probably be boring for you." That answer didn't sit right with me. But again, I ignored the feeling, because I trusted my wife. Or at least I wanted to believe I did. Still, the longer this went on, the more those little warning signs started adding up in my head. The late nights, the expensive clothes, the phone she suddenly guarded like a secret, and the mysterious financial consultant I had never met. Looking back now, all the pieces were already there. I just didn't want to see the picture they were forming. But that was about to change. Because soon, the truth wouldn't come from Megan. It would come from someone else entirely. And when it did, there would be no way left for me to ignore what was happening. The moment everything truly started falling apart didn't come from Megan. Came from someone else. About 3 weeks after the dinner receipt incident, I was at the shop finishing paperwork when my phone buzzed on the workbench. It was a message from an old friend of mine named Kyle. Kyle and I had grown up together in Henderson. These days we didn't see each other as often as we used to, but every once in a while he'd stop by the shop or send a message to check in. The text was simple. "Hey man, quick question. Is Megan with you tonight?" I frowned. "No," I replied. "Why?" A few seconds passed before the next message came in. "I might be mistaken, but I think I just saw her at the Blue Mesa bar." My stomach tightened slightly. Blue Mesa was a small bar on the edge of town. Not a fancy place. Not the kind of place Megan had ever mentioned going to for business meetings. "You sure it was her?" I typed. Kyle responded almost immediately. "Pretty sure. She's sitting in one of the back booths." Then another message appeared. "With some guy." For a moment I stared at the phone without moving. There are certain moments in life when time seems to slow down. When a single sentence forces your brain to process a possibility you've been trying very hard not to think about. This was one of those moments. I told myself again there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe this guy was a client. Maybe it was that financial consultant she had mentioned. Maybe it really was business. Still, I typed one more message. "Are they talking or?" Kyle took a few seconds to respond. When the reply finally came, it was only 4 words. "Ryan. They're holding hands." My chest felt tight. Before I could respond again, another message appeared. "And they just kissed." I didn't reply after that. Instead, I sat there in the shop office staring at the phone screen while 1,000 thoughts crashed into each other inside my head. Part of me wanted to jump into my truck and drive straight to that bar. Part of me didn't want to see it. Because once you see something like that with your own eyes, you can never pretend it didn't happen. Eventually Kyle sent one more message. "I'm really sorry, man. I thought you should know." I locked my phone and sat there in silence for a long time. The strange part was that I didn't feel explosive anger. Not at first. What I felt instead was something colder. A quiet realization that all those small doubts over the past few weeks hadn't been paranoia. They had been warnings. And now they were turning into something real. But the confirmation didn't end there. A few days later something else happened. Something that removed the last bit of uncertainty I still had. It happened on a Saturday afternoon. I had taken a rare day off from the shop and was sitting at the kitchen table going through some invoices. Megan had told me she needed to meet Daniel Harris again to discuss investment options. At that point, the name didn't make me comfortable anymore. But I didn't say anything. Around 3 in the afternoon, my stepson Tyler walked into the kitchen. Tyler was Megan's son from a previous relationship. He was 16, quiet, and usually spent most of his time playing video games in his room. He grabbed a soda from the fridge and was about to walk out when he paused. "Hey Ryan," he said. "Yeah. Can I ask you something?" "Sure." He leaned against the counter, looking uncertain. "That guy that keeps coming over, is he your friend?" The question caught me off guard. "What guy?" Tyler shrugged. "The tall guy. The one who comes here sometimes during the day." I slowly put my pen down. "What are you talking about?" "The guy who talks to Mom in the kitchen," he said. "He's been here a few times." A cold feeling spread through my chest. "When?" I asked. "Usually when you're at work," Tyler replied casually. "I've seen him a couple times when I came home early from school." My heart was beating harder now. "Do you know his name?" Tyler thought for a moment. "I think Mom called him Daniel once." The room felt suddenly very quiet. "Did they say what he was doing here?" I asked. Tyler shook his head. "Not really. They just talked." Then he hesitated. "There was one time they were standing really close though." I didn't say anything. Tyler glanced at me, suddenly realizing something might be wrong. "Did I say something bad?" he asked. "No," I said quietly. "You didn't do anything wrong." He nodded and walked back down the hallway toward his room. I stayed sitting at the kitchen table long after he left. Because between Kyle's message from the bar and Tyler's casual comment about Daniel visiting the house while I was at work, the last piece of denial finally disappeared. There were no more excuses left. No more "maybe it's business." No more explanations that made everything feel normal. For the first time since finding that restaurant receipt, I knew the truth. My wife wasn't just meeting with a financial consultant. She was seeing another man. And somehow, while I had been working long days trying to keep our business running, it had been happening right under my own roof. For a couple of days after Tyler told me about Daniel visiting the house, I didn't confront Megan. I wanted to. Every time she walked into the room, every time she casually talked about business meetings, every time she mentioned Daniel's name like he was some harmless financial consultant, I felt the words building in my throat, but I held them back, because something inside me kept saying the same thing. If she was lying this easily, then there was probably more I didn't know. So instead of exploding, I started paying attention. Really paying attention. At first I watched small things, her schedule, the way she handled paperwork, the way she talked about the shop's finances. For years I had trusted Megan to manage the books. Numbers had always been her strength, and honestly, accounting bored me to death. I preferred working in the garage, building suspensions and engines. But now that trust felt different. One evening after Megan went out again for what she called another investor meeting, I sat down at the desk in our home office and opened the shop's financial software. I hadn't done that in a long time. At first everything looked normal. Monthly expenses, supplier payments, payroll for the mechanics. But then I noticed something strange. There were several transfers listed that I didn't recognize. They weren't huge amounts individually. 5,000 here, 8,000 there. But they were all companies I had never heard of. I leaned closer to the screen. The company names sounded generic. Desert Horizon Holdings, Silver Ridge Logistics, Western Equipment Consulting. None of them rang any bells. I clicked on one of the transactions and opened the details. The payment had been labeled Consulting Services. Consulting services for what? We ran a repair shop, not a tech startup. I scrolled through the records further. More transfers appeared. Different dates, different amounts, but the same unfamiliar companies. A heavy feeling started building in my chest. Because when you run a small business, you know every dollar that goes in and out. You have to. Margins aren't big enough to ignore that kind of thing. Yet somehow these payments had slipped past me. Or more accurately, I had never looked. Because Megan handled the finances. And I trusted her. I pulled out my phone and searched the first company name online. Nothing came up except a basic registration listing in Nevada. No website, no contact information, no business history. That was the moment when the uneasiness turned into something sharper. I searched the second company. Same result. A shell company with almost no public presence. The third company produced exactly the same thing. Now my heart was beating faster. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the computer screen while the pieces started forming a pattern in my head. Unknown companies, regular transfers, all approved through the shop's accounts. I opened the file history to see who had authorized the payments. Every single one of them had Megan's login attached. For a moment I tried to convince myself again there had to be a normal explanation. Maybe Daniel Harris had set up these consulting services. Maybe it was part of the investor process. But something about the numbers didn't make sense. The payments weren't connected to any real contracts. There were no invoices attached, just digital authorizations, which meant one thing: someone had created them. I spent the next hour digging through every financial report I could find. And the deeper I looked, the worse it got. The transfers went back almost 4 months. In total, nearly $70,000 had quietly disappeared from the shop's accounts. 70,000. That wasn't just a bookkeeping mistake. That was deliberate. My hands felt cold as I leaned forward and opened another folder Megan had been working on. Inside were several scanned documents. Loan applications, business expansion proposals, projected budgets. At first glance, it looked like she really was trying to expand the shop. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. One of the loan applications listed collateral. And the property used as collateral wasn't the shop. It was my father's ranch. The ranch had been in my family for 2 generations. When my dad retired, he had agreed to let me use the land as backup security for the business if I ever needed it. But we had never actually taken out a loan against it. Until now. My eyes moved slowly across the document. The loan amount being requested was enormous. More money than my shop had ever seen. And Megan's digital signature was already attached. But the line that made my chest tighten the most was the final section. Authorized business partners. Megan Cooper. Daniel Harris. I sat there in silence staring at the screen. Because suddenly everything made sense. The late-night meetings. The mysterious consulting companies. The financial transfers. They weren't preparing the shop for expansion. They were draining it. And once the large loan went through using my father's ranch as collateral, they would disappear with the money. I closed the laptop slowly and leaned back in the chair. For the first time since all of this started, anger finally began replacing the shock. Because the affair was bad enough. But this wasn't just betrayal. This was a plan. And Megan and Daniel had been building it right in front of me. They just assumed I'd never notice. After discovering the money transfers and the loan documents tied to my father's ranch, the first thing I felt wasn't rage. It was clarity. For weeks I had been stumbling through half-truths and suspicions, trying to piece together what Megan was hiding from me. Now the picture was finally complete. She wasn't just cheating. She and Daniel were planning to destroy everything I had spent 10 years building. And they were planning to do it quietly. The worst part wasn't even the money. It was the ranch. My father had worked that land his entire life. When he got older and couldn't maintain it anymore, he trusted me to keep it safe. Letting me use it as potential collateral for the business had been an act of faith. And Megan had been preparing to risk it behind my back. I sat in the office chair for a long time, staring at the laptop screen, while the anger slowly settled into something colder and more controlled. Exploding wouldn't help. If I confronted Megan right now, she would deny everything, warn Daniel, and the two of them would disappear before I could stop them. No. If I wanted to protect the shop and my father's ranch, I needed to be smarter than that. So I did something Megan probably never expected. I pretended everything was normal. The next morning, when she came home from another meeting, I greeted her the same way I always did. "Morning," I said casually while pouring coffee. She looked a little tired but smiled. "Morning." I asked about her meeting. She told me the same polished story she had been repeating for weeks. "Daniel thinks we're getting close to securing an investment group," she said while scrolling through her phone. I nodded and played along. That's good news. Inside, though, I was already making plans. Later that day, I went back through the shop's financial records and began quietly copying everything. Bank statements, transfer confirmations, digital authorizations, the loan application tied to my father's ranch. Every piece of evidence I could find. I saved it all onto an external drive and backed it up again on a secure cloud account Megan didn't know existed. The deeper I dug, the more disturbing the pattern became. The companies receiving the money transfers had been created only months earlier. Each one linked to a registered agent service that allowed the real owners to stay hidden. But one detail connected them. The paperwork for two of the companies listed the same contact phone number. When I searched the number online, it appeared in several fraud investigation forums connected to previous business scams. The name attached to those discussions wasn't Daniel Harris. It was something else entirely. That discovery made my stomach turn, because it meant Daniel Harris might not even be his real name. That night, after Megan went to bed, I sat alone in the living room and started researching lawyers. I needed someone who understood both business fraud and divorce law. Eventually, I found one in Las Vegas who specialized in financial crime cases involving small businesses. The next morning, I drove to his office. His name was Mark Caldwell. He was older than I expected, maybe in his early 60s, with the calm demeanor of someone who had seen every kind of mess people could create. I handed him the folder containing the financial records. He spent nearly 20 minutes flipping through the documents without saying a word. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Cooper," he said slowly, "you did the right thing by not confronting them." I felt a small sense of relief hearing that. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Well," he replied, tapping the loan application with his pen. "First we make sure that loan never goes through." He explained that since I was the primary owner of the business and the ranch belonged to my family, Megan couldn't legally secure the loan without my approval. But the attempted paperwork itself was enough to trigger a fraud investigation. Then he pointed to the money transfers. "These," he said, "are even more serious." According to him, the pattern looked like classic embezzlement. Money slowly moved into shell companies until the final step, taking out a large loan and disappearing. The same kind of scheme he had seen multiple times before. "And Daniel Harris?" I asked. The lawyer shook his head. "I'd be very surprised if that's his real name." The room felt colder hearing that confirmed. "So what do we do?" I asked. "We gather more evidence," he said. "Then we involve the bank and law enforcement." He leaned forward slightly. "But until that moment comes, you must not reveal that you know." I nodded. That part one had already decided. For the next several days, I followed his advice exactly. I continued going to the shop every morning. Megan continued attending her mysterious meetings. We had normal conversations over dinner. If she noticed anything different about me, she never showed it. Meanwhile, I kept collecting information. **TS of new transfers. Emails between Megan and Daniel discussing investment opportunities. Draft versions of the loan proposal. Everything. By the end of the week, we had enough evidence to prove the entire scheme. But there was still one final part of my plan. One last step I wanted to take before everything exploded. A few days later, Megan's sister invited us to a small family birthday celebration. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but this time it gave me an idea. Because according to Megan, Daniel Harris was supposed to attend the same event later that evening to discuss the final investment stage, which meant both of them would be in the same place. And that was exactly where I wanted the first crack in their plan to appear. That night, while everyone was gathered in the living room laughing and talking, I quietly slipped my wedding ring off my finger. I walked over to Megan's sister and placed it in her hand. She looked confused. "Ryan." I leaned closer so only she could hear me. "Give this to Megan later tonight," I said quietly, when she's standing next to Daniel. The next morning I made my move. Before the shop even opened, I called the bank and froze every business account. Megan didn't know it yet, but the money trail was already being reviewed. My lawyer sent the evidence to the bank's fraud department and contacted the police. Within days the truth surfaced. Daniel Harris wasn't even his real name. He had been involved in multiple fraud schemes across different states. The plan Megan and Daniel built was already collapsing. The investigation moved quickly after that. Once the authorities followed the financial records, everything pointed directly to Megan and the man calling himself Daniel. Both were arrested for financial fraud and embezzlement. The shop survived because we stopped the loan before it went through, and my father's ranch remained untouched. Losing my marriage hurt more than I expected, but over time I realized something important. Megan didn't destroy my life. She only revealed who I could no longer trust. And sometimes, that truth is the only thing that saves you.